Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to the annual review live chat entitled Racial Justice, Policing and Protest. My name is Tracey Meares. I am a professor at Yale Law School and founding director of the Justice Collaboratory here. I'm also co-editor, along with Rob Sampson, of the annual review of criminology. This discussion is organized by Annual Reviews as part of an initiative to spread scientific ideas and findings that shed light on the current protests and demonstrations that we've seen occurring all across the United States. Annual Reviews is a nonprofit publisher dedicated to synthesizing and integrating knowledge for the progress of science and the benefit of society. Today, we are joined by three incredibly distinguished guests, and their research, actually every one of them has either published a piece in the annual reviews or has a piece forthcoming in the annual review. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. First, we have my incoming colleague, Elizabeth Hinton. She is the incoming professor of history, African American studies, and law at Yale. Elizabeth Hinton's research focuses on the persistence of poverty and racial inequality in the 20th century United States, including the transformation of domestic social programs and urban policing after the civil rights movement. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Hinton's important book, tracing how the United States has transferred federal programs directed at poverty to criminal justice. And you also may have seen her recent op-ed in the New York Times detailing the 1960s effort to shift more power to community organizations. So I'm hoping Dr. Hinton will speak a little bit about that today. Next, we have Tim Newburn, who is professor of criminology and social policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Newburn's research has spanned a number of areas, including policing, restorative justice, youth justice, drugs and alcohol, comparative policymaking, and urban violence. Tim Newburn actually has a forthcoming piece in the annual review of criminology that is very relevant to our current issue about understanding the consequences primarily of what we may call urban unrest, protest, and riot. And finally, we have my colleague, and I can still call her my colleague because Dr. Vesla Weaver, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins, is also a member of the Justice Collaboratory, along with Professor Hinton. Dr. Weaver's research aims at better understanding the causes and consequences of racial inequality in the United States, how state policies and institutions shape political life and identity, and especially the effects of increasing punishment and surveillance in America on democratic inclusion. Dr. Weaver wrote a very important piece in the annual review of political science a couple of years ago with Professor Joe Sauce, looking at this important issue of how in race class subjugated communities, their terms, the state response to the issues that those communities face is often the armed and negative face of the state rather than a positive, beneficent one. And I hope that Professor Weaver will say a few words about that piece or her ideas about that in light of what we are seeing happening in the streets today. So, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to you. And can we start in reverse order in the way that I introduced you? That is, starting with Professor Weaver and ending with Professor Hinton.
Sure. So I'll just begin with a few comments about giving a bit of a broader context. And when we started to write that piece, or even when I started to write my first book, Arresting Citizenship, I think it's important for the audience to know that most academics, particularly in political science, didn't see policing as central to the way that citizens understand and participate in their democracy. And so one of the most important things that we tried to drive home in that piece
So she's frozen for everyone?
She's frozen for me.
She's frozen for me too.
And me.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, everyone.
I'm waiting for some support from our tech folks about what I should be doing right now. Oh my gosh.
You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. So,
Did
oh,
everybody,
Vesla's back.
yeah, did
You
that happen?
actually froze through part of your remarks, actually. So I don't know if you were frozen for yourself, if you could tell. So you couldn't tell? So we were just about to turn to Tim, but why don't you just, if you can summarize what you said, or just say it again, because we have some time.
I'm sorry for the technical difficulty. So I guess what I was saying is that that piece that we wrote was really trying to emphasize that for many race, class, subjugated communities, interactions with police authority is their interaction with government, right? It is a mainstay, it is a main way that they are interacting with government, that they're learning about democracy, that they're seeking to engage the polity. And that if we don't understand that police are the government and are a key method of understanding political authority, then we will miss a lot of what creates democratic learning. And then I think the second point that we made, and this is also in my prior book, Arresting Citizenship, is that what they're learning is not the hallmarks of democracy, the things that we hold up in civics textbooks, the responsiveness and the constitutional protections, and going to the ballot and going to vote at voting time, but instead they're learning the routines of an anti-democratic state. They're learning to be that they are suspicious. They're learning submission. They're learning to disengage and to avoid authority when it imperils their lives. And that's troubling in a democracy predicated on the will of the people, predicated on people feeling that they can reach out to government and have their voices heard.
That's an excellent foundational statement. Thank you. Let's turn to Tim now.
Thank you very much. I'm hugely grateful to, as the outsider from Britain, to be here. And my thanks to the annual review for that. It's also a great pleasure to meet, as it were, virtually, Tracey, Elizabeth, and Vesla, all of whose work I've admired for a long time and learnt from. As Tracey said, the piece I wrote, which is coming out this year, is the original invitation was to write a piece on the causes of rights, and the piece I've written is called, if I remember correctly, The Causes and Consequences of Urban Unrest and Riots. And I think that sort of those slight amendments say a couple of important things. The first one is that I suppose, as someone who's sort of looked at protest and crowd behaviour and urban violence for a long time, been quite struck by the way in which social science generally has been, I mean, on one level for very understandable reasons, very preoccupied by, and I mean, and this includes me too, preoccupied by questions of causation, of etiology. Why do these things happen? They're so unusual, so relatively speaking, so dramatic, so extraordinary in their consequences that immediately when trouble on a mass scale breaks out, people want to know why. They want to know how it happened, and then they want to know how to stop it, what to do about it, how to prevent it in the future. And I suppose if the paper has an aim, it's really to act as a corrective and to say that actually I think that's either not the most important scholarly question, or certainly should be set alongside things which are of equal importance. And in particular, and this brings us to now, is the consequences of protest and uprising and, if you like, riot, which is these things can have consequences across the spectrum and will have consequences potentially across the spectrum, both positive and negative, as vehicles for change. That once violence finishes, once police, in inverted commas, leave communities, with all the caveats we've heard about being the face of government in all sorts, actually for places where unrest happens, the aftermath of violence and destruction and so forth goes on for weeks, for months, for years, perhaps forever in people's lifetimes, both in terms of the social and economic consequences, but also more narrowly in the kind of criminal justice and penal consequences. So that alongside the other thing that's, of course, very clear when one looks at these things, which is the deep way in which the police are implicated, embedded in disorder, not just as, of course, the response to much of it, but also often as the spark for it, makes certainly things I was asked to write about of some resonance at the moment.
Thank you, Tim. And Elizabeth, let's hear from you before we turn to the questions that participants are already sending our way.
So first, I'd just also like to thank the annual review for having this discussion and inviting me to participate. And it's really always an honor to be among Tracey and Vesla, and now to meet you, Tim. It's really great to be in conversation with you. First, I just want to give a little plug to the forthcoming piece that that I have coming out in the annual review of criminology, that I think is really timely right now and should be available in a few weeks. It's an essay or article that I co-authored with an emerging graduate student of mine who is a historian of modern urban policing. And the piece is entitled "The Mass Criminalization of Black Americans, a Historical Overview." And it really, you know, historians have been pretty late in coming into discussions about criminal justice and policing. And so we give a really kind of wide overview of where the literature has grown, especially in the last decade, and provide an account of how we can understand the intersections between racism and the development of the US criminal justice system, from slave patrols to Operation Ceasefire in the 1990s during the war on gangs. So if you're interested in finding out more information about how we got here, or just kind of want an article that you might be able to assign in your classes to give your students a sense of how the longer history of racism in the criminal justice system, I hope that you'll turn to our piece. I've been thinking a lot recently as we're coming into these new national discussions about the future of policing and criminal justice, and also new conversations and new awareness about racial injustice in this country, about some of the lessons from my work and from the kind of failed promises of the 1960s. And a lot of this I wrote about in my op-ed. But I think, you know, we have a new opportunity to do something that we never really committed to before, which is to empower communities and begin to give resources to communities to address their needs on their own terms. And one of the things that, you know, the story of the development of the war on crime and the war on drugs and the war on gangs is really about is these moments when community-based crime prevention programs were funded and tested, but were never sustained. And we know that these programs are much more effective at keeping communities safe than giving police more hardware to surveil people and patrol communities. We know these programs work. We know that throwing more money at police departments has been one of the biggest domestic policy failures in US history. And so when people like Joe Biden talk about ending systemic racism with a new $300 and some million investment into police departments, into body cams and more community policing programs, I get really nervous. So that's what I've been thinking about right now. And I want to see communities come out of this whole thing with a new level of resources that are at scale or above where we're funding police departments right now.
That is an excellent set of opening remarks. As I said before, we have a number of questions already. I'd like to remind participants there are over 380 of you out there, so thanks for joining us. that you can post your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. And then the AR team will actually funnel those questions to me so that I can ask the panelists. So from my perspective, it looks like I'm sitting in a room with Tim and Elizabeth and Vesla. So here's a proposal for how we do this. I have a couple of questions right now that I'd like to ask. And if the questions don't come in at the pace that I expect they will, just coming up with a contingency plan, I am more than willing and probably able to keep the conversation going by asking you all questions that I come up with. I'm going to pose a question to the group, and then without naming any particular person, suggest that you all take the question, and then I might ask a person who hasn't answered a question if they want to add on. We have about, I'd say, 35 minutes-ish. The AR folks can tell me better. We have got plenty of time to have a very fulsome discussion. Okay, so here's a first question. This one comes from Berlin. The questioner says that we see tons of images of protests in the United States, and it's clear that that protest results in something. This is getting back to Tim's point. Like, we see government officials responding. We see certain kinds of response. The questioner from Berlin is asking, do we know which ways we can implement and support long-lasting change? And I think the implication of the question is something like, is protest the best way? Or, if there are other ways, what are they? I mean, I feel like each one of you probably has something pretty important to say about that question. So don't all jump in at once.
I guess I can start. And I think that in this moment, we don't yet, right, we're living through the moment. We don't yet have the empirical foundation to understand whether the consequences of this protest wave will depart sharply from past protest waves. But I will say a few things. The first thing is that I've been thinking about again and again and again in these past few weeks, is that every major uprising against police occupation and repression in the United States, at least, has been followed, and I think Elizabeth was intimating to this, has been followed by serious policy change, but not transformation. Mm-hmm. And has been followed, in fact, by expansionary logics around the police. So if you look at the late 1960s and early 70s protests, right, that yields us one of the biggest expansions in the carceral state that we'd ever seen. It yields us one of the biggest expansions and institutionalizations of police power that the nation had seen. Similarly, this happens again in the 90s Rodney King protest wave, and it happens even again in the post-Ferguson protest wave. Mm-hmm. Right, calls for, even among progressive reformers and progressive academics, well, we have to fund our way out of this problem. We have to expand funding for police because we need better training, more resources, and what that ultimately yields is more manpower. I mean, the police forces in this country doubled across the 70s, and in some cities tripled. After the 60s Black freedom struggles. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that pulls in a bit of a different direction, and there is good empirical social science on the consequences of protests. Daniel Gillian has done a lot of work here, looking at how do protests give rise to national policy change? How do they change Supreme Court decisions? How do they change, how much presidents are giving State of the Union addresses? And, just to summarize his work, the empirical finding there is that they matter a lot, and even violent protests, right? On the other side of that debate is Omar Wasow, who of course, shows that protests often do also lead to voter backlash, right? So there's kind of two sides, and I think both to a certain extent hold water. James Button, the early political scientist who writes a book called Black Violence, and then another one on the consequences of protest. Tim, I don't know if you engage that work at all in your article, but basically shows that funding changes at the local and state and federal levels. But then I would point to another broader consequence, which is that millions of new American voters are being socialized in this moment. They're being socialized in a moment of high racial salience, high solidaristic responses, a moment where a critique that I didn't imagine just 5 years ago, right, of police oppression is now mainstream, right? They're being socialized in a moment. And we know from work that from scholarly work that protests, social movements forge racial identity. They forge a sense of the state. They forge a critique and a framework and an analysis. And so I'm hopeful that this wave is giving rise to a new group that is going to be exercising political power and influence, and they have a set of logics that were sort of unimaginable just 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, Vesla, that's really good. I'm glad you ended up with the point about how this moment is shaping new participants, because as I turned to Tim and Elizabeth, I had a few more questions come in on the sidebar, and 3 of them were almost exactly the same about what can we say about the moment or the fact that so many young people are participating in these demonstrations and protests. And I think one answer is what you had to say, Vesla, but Tim and Elizabeth might also have something to say about that.
Well, I think that Vesla's point about the ways in which civil rights protests has led to these more kind of insidious punitive measures historically is really important. I also think, I'm cautiously optimistic and inspired by what's going on. As Vesla said, I feel like history is speeding up before our eyes. I mean, we've seen within the past few days these Confederate monuments be torn down and be graffitied and violated during these protests. And that is a debate that we've been having for a really long time. So I do think that the key thing is, I tell my students, we're not, policymakers and officials don't make major social changes out of the goodness of their heart. It's up to the people to put pressure on them. And I think that, we saw that the gains of the civil rights movement. And, I think that we're beginning to see that today with these new conversations that are being, that are now becoming mainstream, as Vesla pointed out. So I think, the key is to keep the pressure on, and to keep kind of speeding up these discussions. And I think, it's empowering to see so many young people and such a diverse group of Americans from all kinds of different socioeconomic and racial and ethnic backgrounds out there in the street fighting for racial justice and kind of changing the terms of the conversation. So as Vesla says, I think as long as we, if this group of this community can stay mobilized and keep the pressure on and go out and vote, we might we might get closer to the kinds of transformations that we did not witness in earlier decades.
Tim, do you have anything to add?
Well, let me just sort of kind of reinforce and add a little bit. I mean, I completely agree that significant social change is rarely brought about without public protest, and often, and sadly, violent public protest. And so just to take one tiny example, because it picks up on what's just been said about Confederate statues and so forth. We, in our small way in England, have just had the beginnings of a movement to possibly begin to kind of rid our society of of statues of people whose money and renown was made in the slave trade. And the only reason that that conversation is now actually taking place is because of the, as it were, violent, forced removal of one statue in one city. Without that, it would have just continued, I think, as a conversation rather than as the potential for a social movement. It actually requires action to make change. But just to widen this into one or two other examples, because we've got in recent times 3 really important, rather contrasting examples, I think, of the ways in which these things work out differently. There was a moment a decade ago when the Arab Spring really looked like the mobilization of youth across a whole region was going to bring about substantial and radical political change. And indeed it did to a degree, but then it ran out of steam, repression took its place, and well, the rest we know. From where we currently stand, things may change again. The second is what's currently unfolding in Hong Kong, which is a series of protests beginning really around 2014 with the Umbrella Revolution, but then going through education protests and a variety in the Occupy protests and so forth, which have gathered pace, which have radicalized and politicized, a generation of young people to come out onto the streets and a variety of others, but now with extraordinarily negative consequences for those young people, and who knows where it will go. But to end on an optimistic note, and it's an optimistic note that sadly arises out of armed struggle rather than peaceful protest. But we have on our doorstep here the example of Northern Ireland, where after years of civil war and public protest, actually what we saw and what still holds actually is a peace process and radical social transformation. So it is possible. Whether I'm on the kind of optimistic end or pessimistic end, I'm still unsure.
Okay. So this next set of questions, there are about 4 or 5 of them that I'm going to try to connect together. And they have to do with your understanding of the term defunding of police forces in the United States and community-based alternatives. What does that mean? But importantly, in the context of our enterprise here, the 4 of us are researchers, academics who, publish in places like the Annual Review. Our audience is not necessarily entirely researchers, but one of the questions related to this issue about, well, what does that mean, has to do with how do we think about how experts can use data or research to ensure that as this transformation takes place, we are engaging in strategies that are, at least in the questioner's view, the most effective. And, in particular, there's just this question about, what is the role of science in this particular conversation?
Well, I think I guess I'll start with the second question in terms of role of science. I think that we really need more qualitative data on people's experiences with the criminal justice system, and I know that this is something that's near and dear to us here, especially Tracey and Vesla, and I'm sure they'll talk about their Portals project. But one of the things projects that I've been involved in Stockton, California, in an attempt to for the police department to reckon with past harms is to do fact finding, which involves not only going through police records, but going into communities and interviewing people and hearing about their stories and their experiences with police and holding that also as a truth, just like a data point or just like, a document might be. So I think that we really need to empower and take seriously people's grievances and weigh those grievances as valuable pieces of evidence as we think about moving forward. So that's part of it. So then the other question was about what defunding the police means, or how to approach defunding the police. Should I? Okay, so
either way, I mean, what it means to you, or how would we do it? But it's also related to this question about research, right?
Yeah. So I think it's really, and it's something that I alluded to early on. Thinking about a different set of investments, and what that means is also like, I think rethinking what public safety means, and how. I think that public safety means that everybody has access to clean water. And I think that public safety means that every child in the United States has access to an equally stellar education. We have good public schools in the United States, but they're in the suburbs. They're not in low-income urban communities. It's possible to make those public schools also, thriving and vital. So I think, part of it, and, some people look at that as a kind of a divest invest paradigm. Fine. I mean, I think we need to challenge our current priorities. And as I said before, I think that the way to do that is to empower communities to come up with their own visions and programs to realize public safety, and not an outside force of police officers.
Tim, Vesla, anything on the, what do we as academics do to sort of, advance this moment? And, in particular, there is a question from an organizer, and I'll quote the question: "What can scholars do to help the public at large forge a reflection?" This is from an organizer, right? Well, so I actually think that that's relevant to our conversation here.
Can I just jump in on that, and then I'll be quiet. I think, and there's a movement that's emerging, I think, among scholars to do this. But for too long, scholars, especially social scientists, have imposed their research projects on communities and used communities as test subjects. And I think that moving forward, we need to reframe our research and do research with communities and listen to people's questions and find research projects from the problems that they identify, not the problems that we identify. So I would say to that organizer, be in touch with scholars in your communities and develop a research project together. I think we all, to do this kind of vital research, we all have our own sets of expertise, whether you're, a PhD or PhD many times over, or, a garbage collector who's been living in your community for 50 years. And we can bring those expertise together and make a better world out of it.
I completely agree with what Elizabeth just said. I think that I remember sitting in a room of community organizers around, and this was after Ferguson, but predates this moment. And we were talking about policing, and she said, "We don't need another study. We don't need another study commissioned. We don't need, the nonprofit industrial complex to tell us what to do. We know the problems, but we're not being listened to." And I think that's absolutely right. And so one of the things that my co-authors and I were just discussing is adding survey items that actually use the voices from our Portals project. And I'll just say just one sentence on that. This is a massive qualitative ethnographic kind of data collection that Tracey, myself, and Gwen Prowse set out to do in the aftermath of Ferguson, because we felt like there was a lot of, statistics being bandied about, a lot of, well, communities like this think that, without actually ever listening to those communities. And so we set about to collect discourse in several cities in very highly policed neighborhoods. And so we're now using some of the very consistent framings and the actual voices of those participants to ask questions on social surveys that have never been asked before, and that we think will enrich the conversation. So when, when we ask people, well, do you trust the police or not? That's a helpful question, but it's not the only question we should be asking. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing that I would say about defunding the police is that this is relatively a new claim, but if you look at the history, if you look at even, the past couple of years, several groups, there's a group in Oakland that has proposed a people's budget, which is basically about rerouting some of that money towards community well-being. And so a vastly reduced police budget. So this isn't just happening in the protests now. There are groups out there that have worked to create municipal budgets that would be enhancing to safety and health and education and engagement. And then the last thing is that I want to point out about these protests is, and this is something too that I've learned through the Portals dialogues, is that many folks have lived through, right? They'll say in the Portals, they'll say, I lived through Rodney King. I lived through Crown Heights. I lived through all these past moments of contestation and contentious politics where we called for a reimagining of what policing would look like. And we weren't listened to. And so now I'm living through this again, and it just seems to be that we're repeating the state failures of the past. And so I guess I would put on the table for all of us, I'm curious to hear what Elizabeth and Tim and Tracey think will lead us to not make those same mistakes again. Like, what will yield true transformation? What will make it so that we're not destined to have this, 2 steps forward, 1 step back dynamic within, we respond to police violence, we ask for things, and then we end up arriving at an equilibrium that sort of recreates what we had before.
That's a great point, and actually it's akin to another question, so I'm gonna reframe it a little bit and also turn to Tim and see what other folks have to say. For more on, I'm like an advertiser. For more on the Portals Project, go to Portals Policing Project, all one word, .com, and you can see some photos of the great work that was definitely helmed by Vesla and Vesla and Gwen and some of our joint research papers together. But the last point you made about 1 step forward, 2 steps back, there's another question in my long list of questions responding to something that Elizabeth Hinton said, where the questioner says, well, if it's a failure, and we know it's a failure, then why are we still doing it? I mean, it's a really interesting question. I would like to also pose it in a comparative context, at least policy-wise, which is, think about public education in this country. There was a sustained effort to reframe public education that was really organized around the idea that these institutions were failing. And if public schools were failing, they ought not exist. We should close them down. They shouldn't get any money. I'm not saying that that was the best way of doing it and that I wholeheartedly endorse all the ways in which the Broad Foundation and the Gates Foundation, who were instrumental in doing this, did that work. But I do find it interesting that this incredibly important aspect of the state that's importantly adjacent to the criminal justice system, had this major reform based on its failure. And the response to that was, well, we're going to take resources away. Whereas in contrast here, as both Vesla and Elizabeth mentioned, the response on the policing side has been to provide more resources. Anyway, so Tim, any thoughts on that issue and the last question before I try to find another one?
Well, yes, let me just a couple of brief things on the first 2 questions that were asked, and very brief. I mean, obviously, on this side of the Atlantic, we're not having this, whatever, defund the police conversation. And in the main, I guess, we're not having it because we haven't, at least quite, reached the point of crisis that American policing seems to have reached. It's not to say that many of the things that that you're talking about that are problematic with American policing aren't also problematic with British policing, but we don't have the scale of the problem, I think, nor the depth, nor the history of it that's present there in the US. So we're not having that conversation. However, but having said that, the defund the police conversation strikes me as hugely consequential, not just in the US, obviously, but more generally, because it opens up a radical space for the idea of change, which we over here may not embrace in its entirety. But I think, well, as it were, horrible metaphor, but put on the table possibilities that wouldn't otherwise be considered. And there's a sense in which, so I don't, defund the police, from what I hear and what I see and so forth, seems to mean, sometimes quite radically different things to different people. But fundamentally, there's that old sort of well-repeated sociological, criminological, whatever historical finding about poor and minority communities, what Joe Soss and Vesla would call race, class, subjugated communities, which says, look, the fundamental problem in relation to things like this is people say they feel simultaneously over-policed and under-protected, okay? So I take, from my outsider's point of view, the kind of defund the police to be another way of coming at that argument, which is to say, how do you simultaneously de-police, as it were, do less policing, whilst offering more protection, more security, more safety, whatever that may mean, from clean drinking water to good schools through to a whole bunch of other things. And that strikes me as a kind of transferable question to jurisdictions which maybe even don't have those scale of problems, but is nonetheless the way in which I think we should think about it. Then just so academics, what should academics be doing? And I say this not just because of my co-presenters here, and I completely agree with all the kind of ideas about new studies and new data and so forth that are required. But I do think, and as I say, all credit to Elizabeth and to Vesla, what we need is more history. And it's precisely because of the question that was being asked and you were asking, Tracey, which is, why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? How is it possible that so little change occurs? And in part, and this is so true of where I sit, so this is so true of Britain, is that we have absolutely no sense of our history here. Okay, this is actually a much greater problem here, I think, which is we have written out of the picture the kind of uncomfortable history of our nation or nations here. And until we begin to embrace that, there is no hope for doing anything differently at all, I think. And so finally on that, there's unfortunately there's that that old thing that used to be said in whatever the kind of electoral war or presidential electoral war room about it's the economy, stupid, in relation to elections. In the background to all of this, I mean, what you're talking and confronting and living is not just a racialized order there, which needs to be challenged, but an entrenched neoliberal economic order. And without change to that, which we're seeing, our nation has been, dare I say, about as bad as yours at dealing with the pandemic for precisely, I think, well, for many similar kinds of reasons. But it's the nature of the political and economic leadership and the degree to which that neoliberal leadership is now embedded in our world, and which we absolutely have to change.
So I did want to say that there was a very long question that came in for Tim that spoke exactly to this last point you made. And I just want to quote from part of the question. Currently, youngsters are not taught in school about the second wave of colonization, the part the UK played in that and how it benefited from the colonization of Africa and its role in the slave trade. Instead, youngsters are taught that slavery is entirely the fault of the United States and that the UK were in fact liberators of slavery. This is this point about history, its complexity, and what people understand in this moment about the United States, but also about the role of other countries in the global nature of enslaving Africans, in the world. All right. And so I wanted to mention that to let the questioner know that I did notice the question. I hadn't given it to Tim, but he basically addressed your question. Okay, so I think we have about 15 minutes left. I want to bring together a whole bunch of questions about that basically sound in what can we do to reform the police now? So we have been talking about the role of trying to change the shape of the state to provide real security, what that would mean, in terms of political movements and in terms of looking at that question through history and the like. And rather than having that question in terms of the technicalities of what can be done, I'd like to bring in some other questions that I think relate to that. So for example, there are a few questions about what's the role of technology in this, in the sense that technology, of course, can give us a world in which there is less contact between people and the armed first responders, but technology could raise the specter of greater surveillance and other things that people might consider to be, really dangerous. Similarly, there's several questions about the role of unions here in police reform. So without talking necessarily about what specifically can we do nuts and bolts, it might be useful to hear what each of you has to say from your respective disciplines, historically, politically, Vesla, Tim, sociologically and organizationally, what role unions and collective bargaining can play in this process and has played in the past to impede the process. And then finally, there is a question again about, thinking about research, and what role is research of all kinds. We've spoken about qualitative, but there are a few questions about, thinking about quantitative research and what role that plays in this issue of what is it that we can do with police forces now. Okay, go.
Shall I say a word on a couple of these, just very quickly? So I think you answered the question. The thing I wanted to say about technology is its sort of Janus face, I think, which is but body cameras, I guess, are one of the latest technologies which are seen potentially as some sort of panacea for the sort of governance of officer conduct. But we know in relation to body cams that they're not a fail-safe. They get turned off. We know that they're protected, or access to what body cams record then become things which political power restricts access to and so forth. But precisely as you were pointing out, I think the other thing potentially about the body cam is its capacity for surveillance. It's the way in which one of the most worrying recent developments in policing is facial recognition, I think, and the deployment of facial recognition, a technology which can be embedded in body cameras. And so we talk about a variety of other technologies, but I'm deeply suspicious about technology as a solution to the problems that we're talking about. On unions, this isn't, obviously I'm the outsider here, but the surprising thing, I think, from a kind of British point of view, looking at American, or one of the surprising things about American policing in relation to unionization, is the political role that unions play. And by that I mean, as it were, the kind of overt party political role that union and union officials play. Something which, I won't say it doesn't happen here, but broadly speaking, the very idea of someone pitching up in a T-shirt emblazoned with a particular president's name and shaking the president's hand in a kind of campaign rally would be seen as, that's sort of the equivalent over here. That would be seen as completely unacceptable, and to my eyes is completely unacceptable in policing. I mean, policing in one sense is inextricably political, but I think of it as political in a different way, as it were. The final thing I want to say about research, I think, is, if one looks back at the last, 40 years ago or so of reform in American policing and the role of research, or just reform generally, it seems to have come from two places. Police reform has either come from outside police departments. So it's come from academics or quasi-academics. So it's come from Herman Goldstein or George Kelling and James Q. Wilson or whoever else it may be. It's come from people in the academy, or it's come from a combination of people in the academy and police leadership. Where it's never really come from is the rank and, from communities, of course, but also the rank and file of the police service. And it does seem to me that those two things go hand in hand, actually. I mean, there's very, very different positions and histories and perspectives, but the silencing of communities and the silencing of the rank and file is actually of those things that I think work very much in parallel and in concert. And so in terms of research, I think that's one of the things that has to change.
Vesla, I saw a finger.
Yeah, I think I have trouble with this question because, and I always have trouble with this question because I don't think that there are a series of fixes or adjustments or reforms that can be made without a broader reorientation happening. So the state's orientation to poor and Black and brown communities has been one of you are a suspect, you deserve incredible oversight, you deserve to have heavy involvement and yet not any kind of knowledge of what your struggles are, right? Heavy involvement of surveillance and punitive responses, but not of responses that really would try to undermine the safety deprivation that you endure multi-generationally, okay? And so I think, some technological enhancements are fine. There's been some, studies on how effective they are or not. And even though I'm a social scientist and I deeply believe in empirics, I also deeply believe that this country needs a philosophical reorientation and reimagining of the democratic possibilities of Black and brown communities, of seeing them as important, expert, as untapped contributors to what this democracy is, right? And without that broader reorientation, I am deeply pessimistic that any sort of one by one fixes will move the needle on where we're at. This is a generations long problem. I've been so shocked at how many people have said to me, I just had no idea. I had no idea that 12-year-olds were regularly being stopped. I had no idea that my cousin in a little church chat that we had revealed that her son in college now had 1 year where he had been stopped 9 times, right? And so I think the first thing we need to do is to, as researchers, is to really show how long-standing this problem is. I've been listening to, Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon, right, where she interviews one of the last slaves to be brought from the Gold Coast to Mobile, Alabama. And right smack in the middle of his biography of her interviewing him and his experience, he discusses how he loses children to police violence, There it is. It's right there. And in every single piece of Black literature, of Black poetry, of Black academia, police violence and police power are very much present, right? They're present long before broken windows expands the scope of policing authority, right? That this, in some sense, is the way that American democracy deals with Black people. And so I think that until we have that broader reorientation and until we have that broader historical understanding that this is what it means to be a Black subject in American democracy, I don't think that we're going to get towards reforms. Now, with that said, I would offer up two reforms that I think can get us part of the way there. One is, can we establish something akin to a democracy index for policing? I'm often asked, well, which police forces are doing it right? Which police forces, are conveying that they regard Black communities in ways that don't hurt them? And so I think we need a version of the democracy index, right, to which police forces, a policing index, or I don't even have the term for it, but something like that, that can look at gradations of interacting with communities in ways that enhance their lived experience and not, expose them to incredible amounts of surveillance and force. And then the second thing I've written about, specifically with Amanda Geller, and that in that piece, and it's called Depolicing of American Youth, or Depolicing American Children, or something like that. And we basically say that it's almost like an early policing abolition argument, but with regard to youth. And we basically use the deinstitutionalization of children, of prisons, right? Youthful prisons, as an example to build on. We can depolice youth, right? There's no public safety justification for a police officer interacting with my 8-year-old son, okay? And yet that is exactly what happens in this country. We called policing the unofficial childhood policy of the United States, right? We showed evidence from the NYPD policing database, as well as our portals database, that the average age of a first encounter with police is actually under the tender age of 14, right? These are moments where police are asking them, why are you standing on this corner? What's in your bag? These are not in the main moments where predatory violence is happening, and yet they convey incredible damage to youth, to their psyche. Many of them end up having PTSD symptoms. Many of them end up having grades drop, reading scores drop, right? It's not worth those deleterious consequences. So that's one thing I wanted to, that I have been saying many times over. You've probably heard me in other fora saying this, that if we dismantle policing of youth, we will starve a very critical input into the system.
Thank you, Vesla. Elizabeth, wrap us up on this, and then I've got one more question for you.
So just on the, I'll be really quick. So just on the technology part, just to add to some of Tim's comments, historically, again, this is thinking about failures. Technology, throwing money at the problem and kind of new technology and hardware for police departments does not work. But what it does do, I mean, at least, one example is the case in the 1960s, where essentially new federal grants to fight the war on crime helped make the Motorola Corporation, which received huge amounts, tens of millions of dollars of federal grants for walkie-talkies and computerized fingerprinting data banks for police officers. And today, as especially the computer surveillance technologies have really improved, not only does this lead to civil liberties violations, but also like the kind of, it supports the kind of policing and patrol programs that we're talking about in neighborhood hotspots and things like that, where communities are saturated with police officers. So to the other question about like why, despite the fact that these are failures, why do we continue on this path? I think, the cynical view is to ask, well, maybe the system is working by design, right? I think really at the root of this is racism. And I think if we are truly going to overcome this, we've got to deal with racism. We've got to deal with the history of racial injustice in our country. So again, the importance of history. But also it's going to mean that if we're going to realize the transformations that we've been talking about in this conversation and conversations that are happening outside of this Zoom room, elites are going to have to give something up, and white people are going to have to give something up. And I think the part of why these failed policies have continued is that there is a real reluctance on the part of elites, on the part of white people, to give up what's going to be required to really realize a truly equitable society in the United States.
Okay. So we're now at just over an hour. I just want to point out, I already had a pre-agreement with my panelists. They're going to stay with me for at least a couple of minutes. But speaking to the well over 300 of you still watching, I just want to let you know that we are going to be respectful of your time. And I'm just going to ask one more question of the panelists and ask you, if you can, to make your answers as short as possible. This is a kind of question actually that will allow you follow up with the AR staff so that they can actually post your answers to this question upon reflection. And I think in light of what we've been talking about with respect to youth, this is a critical question. So here's a question. Thank you for all your insights. I'm wondering how I can share academic information with my communities. I know many people around my age, 18 to 25, who don't have the time, attention span, prior knowledge, or interest to read academic texts. I often want to simplify the works of academics to share their insights, especially via social media. I don't want to dilute the works of scholars, but I do want to make their ideas more accessible. As scholars, how do you feel about your ideas being paraphrased and simplified? Can readers respectfully and effectively share complex ideas from texts about racial justice and policing to folks who don't read very much? So if each one of you could give your thoughts of that incredibly important question, and then think of your answer to that as a your wrap up to this session. And then if you have further ideas, I will make sure as editor of the Annual Review of Criminology that I pass it on to the annual reviews and we can get this out, because I think it's an important issue. So let's start with Vesla, go to Tim, and Elizabeth, you'll have the last word.
That's such a good question. And I would say that we bear a lot of the responsibility in getting out our ideas to you. And I think we're starting to do a bit of a better job of that. I mean, I think Elizabeth, Tracey, Tim, you all embody what public intellectualism is, and you engage in very wide ways. So I think the onus is on us as academics to distill some of our findings in policy briefs. I would suggest that you go to the Scholars Strategy Network webpage, because there's thousands of academics there who do policy-oriented, problem-oriented research. And what we do is we have 2-page little kind of distillations of our central findings. I often use them in my classes. If I just want a quick skim, on, what's the latest on racialized wealth inequality, or what's the latest on, the Flint water crisis, I go there to look up findings of academics that I trust. And it's by now a very, very large database. And so I would say that's what you can do. I also think that the best scholars tend to have a concept alongside their findings that makes the finding intuitive. So Tracey is one of the sort of founding scholars of a sense of an idea called police legitimacy, right, and procedural justice. long ago when I was writing my work, I coined a term, frontlash. Then I coined another, custodial citizenship. Then I coined another, anti-democratic institutions. And I think that helps boil down what the central finding is in the work, particularly historical work, particularly work that isn't just one kind of neat hypothesis test, but that wants to convey a new idea.
Thanks, Vesla. Tim?
So, very quickly, look, one of the questions was how do you like your work being paraphrased and simplified? Very quickly, I love it. That's fine by me. I'm a big fan of clear writing. I'm not claiming I always do it, but I find the kind of academic conceit, the longer the words and the more complicated the sentence, the idea that that's somehow a kind of an illustration of how clever one is in some kind of ways is so wrong as to be untrue. So yes, we have a duty to try to be straightforward and simple in what we do as much as we possibly can. And anyone else trying to do it for us and helping us get our work out there is only to be encouraged, I think. What's our responsibility and what should we be doing? Well, in addition to what Vesla's been saying, there's a responsibility on us to get out there, not just to write, not just to do things simply, but to be in neighborhoods and communities. And I mean, I know that's exactly what my colleagues here do. The pandemic finally is a terrible thing. It's been quite dreadful. And it's going to sadly continue to be very dreadful for a very long time. But it may have some consequences in amongst the dreadfulness that are positive. And for the academy, one of them is that everyone is being forced to do things on screen via Zoom or other kinds of mediums, which potentially are a vehicle for doing precisely what I say. So when people can't be out there because the distances are too great or the time doesn't work, actually we've got technology now which we're getting used to very quickly, which brings us into people's youth centers, people's clubs, people's living rooms, whatever else it may be. So there I think there's something to hand.
Elizabeth, bring us home.
So I'll do my best. It's a tough act to follow, but I just want to thank the participant for that question. It's a really important question. I do think ultimately it's on academics to make their work accessible, but I think you are in a position where you can synthesize. That's something that we do in history, which is basically like bring different ideas together to make something new. So I think when you obviously you're very curious and obviously you're doing a lot of work and asking questions about the world. So as you find answers to those questions, you're going to develop ideas of your own. That's a synthesis of all these other ideas that led you to your ideas. Like none of us here in this room came up with our ideas on our own. We read other people too and paraphrased them and brought different groups of ideas together to create something new. So I encourage you to do that. And it's important that you do that because the future is in your hands, and I'm counting on you to make a better world for all of us, to help us make a better world. So thank you for what you're doing. And I guess I'll end there.
I can't think of a better way to end. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Vesla, for joining us at the annual reviews, for doing this event. And I hope I will see all of you again soon.
Me too. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Bye.
Thank you all for
being here.
Bye, everyone.